January 1943. A quiet Pacific airfield trembled as a lone American fighter burst into the sky, twisting, climbing, and rolling in ways no U.S. aircraft was supposed to survive. Japanese pilots watching from above were stunned. Their fastest fighters couldn't match the sudden burst of power or the impossible turn that followed. What they didn't know was that this miracle wasn't factory-made. It came from one U.S. mechanic's junk fix. Like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. In early 1943, the Pacific War remained a battleground defined by distance, exhaustion, and uncertainty. No front looked stable for long. Islands shifted from calm to chaos within hours. Supply lines stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, and every gallon of fuel, every crate of ammunition, every replacement engine had to be moved at enormous cost. For American aviators operating from rough coral airstrips, nothing ever felt secure or predictable. Japanese forces still held a sharp edge in the air. Their pilots were battle-hardened and confident, flying machines designed for agility rather than durability. The Mitsubishi A6M0, light and razor-responsive, dominated many early clashes. Its tight turns, blistering climb rate, and long-range endurance frightened American pilots who found themselves flying heavier, less nimble aircraft. Reports from the field consistently repeated the same warnings: don't dogfight a zero. You won't walk away. U.S. pilots were adjusting to a war fought over vast tropical expanses where the weather changed faster than command intelligence could update. 1 hour could bring clear skies, the next would choke visibility with sudden squalls or walls of rising heat. Engines overheated. Metal corroded. Dust from coral runways chewed into propellers and landing gear. Mechanics improvised daily, sometimes hourly, to keep squadrons in the air. Aircraft shortages haunted every command briefing. The factories back home worked tirelessly, but demand outpaced delivery. When a fighter was damaged in combat, repairs depended on what spare parts happened to be available on the island. And most islands rarely had what squadrons needed. Forward bases were built fast, too fast, to store everything. Tents replaced hangars. Scrap piles replaced well-stocked tool sheds. Creativity was no longer a bonus, it became the baseline requirement for survival. Within this strained environment, American maintenance crews formed the unseen backbone of the air war. They slept in shifts, rarely undisturbed, often working through the heat of the Pacific day when engine metal felt almost hot enough to blister skin. Their hands developed permanent grease stains. Their uniforms shredded from crawling beneath fuselages and around engine mounts. They were expected to do the impossible, keep aircraft operational even when spare parts arrived weeks late or never arrived at all. Japanese pilots had no reason to imagine how hard those Americans worked. From their perspective, U.S. aircraft were simply inferior machines flown by men who survived mostly through numbers, not quality. Japanese intelligence briefings emphasized American predictability, heavier planes, slower reaction times, cautious maneuvers, and a dependence on diving speed rather than tight climbs or rolls. Many Japanese aces dismissed American technical ingenuity and assumed the U.S. war machine relied solely on mass production. That assumption masked the reality happening on dozens of small Pacific runways. American mechanics were becoming masters of improvisation. Their enemy expected uniformity, but these ground crews quietly built a culture of adaptation. Improvised wiring harnesses, rebalanced control surfaces, innovative engine cooling tricks, and non-standard field repairs, all became part of daily operations. Some fixes worked brilliantly, others barely held engines together for a single mission. Every modification was a gamble. The squadron at the heart of this story felt the pressure more than most. Their fighters had endured weeks of intermittent combat, frequent relocations, and shortages of everything from spark plugs to propeller blades. Pilots rotated in and out, some wounded, some exhausted, all aware that survival depended heavily on the mechanics who swarmed their aircraft after each mission. Inside this fragile ecosystem, one mechanic, quiet, persistent, experienced, found himself staring at a fighter that simply could not keep up with Japanese threats. Its climb performance sagged. Its roll rate felt sluggish. Its engine ran hotter than acceptable. Flight reports made it clear, if this aircraft didn't improve, its pilot would eventually be outmaneuvered and killed. Factory manuals offered no solutions. Replacement parts were weeks away. The scrap pile behind the maintenance tent held more rust than usefulness. Yet giving up wasn't an option. The Pacific War punished weakness, and every squadron knew the Japanese would exploit even the smallest technical lag. The mechanic understood that the answer wouldn't come from standard procedure. It would require something unconventional, something bordering on reckless. He had watched Japanese fighters execute tight vertical climbs and sharp arcing turns that American planes struggled to mirror. A small increase in throttle response or structural reliability could tip the balance. Even a slight edge could keep a pilot alive long enough to strike back. What he didn't yet know was that the idea forming in his mind, the junk fix that would soon alter his fighter's behavior, would challenge the assumptions of both sides. It would be crafted from scrap metal, odd bolts, and leftover parts deemed too insignificant to matter. And yet that humble collection would soon become the spark that turned a vulnerable US fighter into something the Japanese could not predict. And as the mechanic prepared to attempt the fix that might save a man's life, the broader reality of the Pacific struggle continued pressing inward, setting the stage for a moment no one expected. This tension leads directly into the deeper technical and strategic challenges facing American aircraft. By early 1943, the technical imbalance between American fighters and the Japanese Zero remained one of the Pacific's most persistent challenges. The Zero wasn't invincible, but in the hands of skilled Japanese pilots it behaved like a living creature, light, fluid, and almost unnaturally responsive. American pilots quickly learned that a Zero turning inside their radius could be fatal. The mathematics of survival became painfully clear. The heavier US fighters were designed for durability and firepower, not for the delicate agility demanded by close-range combat in Pacific skies. The aircraft flown by the squadron in this story, sturdy, robust, and built with American industrial confidence, had strengths worth respecting, but they came wrapped in limitations. Its airframe was strong, its engine reliable under normal conditions, and its weaponry heavy enough to shatter an enemy aircraft with just a few solid hits. But the Zero exploited every weakness. A slight delay in roll rate. A slower reaction in banking turns. A tendency to bleed energy too quickly during steep climbs. These imperfections meant that once engaged in a turning battle, American pilots risked trapping themselves in patterns the enemy could easily manipulate. Increasingly, US squadrons depended on altitude, diving speed, and discipline to counteract the Zero's advantages. Tactics emphasized avoiding prolonged turns. Climb rates were carefully managed. Pilots were trained to stay calm when the enemy appeared on their six. Even so, the Pacific's unforgiving environment often exposed the limits of the machinery. Coral dust choked carburetors. Humidity warped wooden control surfaces. Salt air gnawed at metal components that were never meant to endure such climates. Engines that behaved flawlessly in factory tests struggled under tropical heat. Overworked cooling systems pushed cylinder temperatures higher than manuals recommended. These marginal conditions accumulated into real operational strain. Pilots often felt their aircraft resisting maneuvers that the airframe was theoretically capable of executing. Aircraft performance depended not just on design but on maintenance, and that became increasingly difficult as US forces pushed outward across the Pacific. Forward bases lacked spare parts. Makeshift airstrips were built quickly, sometimes within days, on terrain that would never qualify as permanent infrastructure. Supply ships arrived on unpredictable schedules. Crates went missing. Replacement engines sometimes sat 3 islands away because the logistics chain had been stretched thin. Japanese forces recognized this vulnerability. Their own aircraft were fragile, but their doctrine emphasized offensive initiative. If American fighters maintained only marginal performance, the Zero could continually pressure them into disadvantageous positions. Intelligence assessments noted that American aircraft tended to roll slower and climb reluctantly at medium altitude, traits that Japanese pilots could exploit through quick bursts of energy, sudden elevation changes, and tight spirals designed to overwhelm heavy fighters. For American ground crews, this reality was a constant source of urgency. Every minor performance loss could risk a pilot's life. A single engine misfire, a slightly sticky control cable, or a wobble in airflow over the wings during high-speed climbs could push a pilot into unrecoverable danger. Maintenance logs began filling with unusual notes: engine hesitation in pullout, sluggish roll response at 250 knots, elevated temperatures after rapid throttle changes. Each entry meant another puzzle for mechanics already operating at their limits. The mechanic at the center of this story had spent months studying these patterns. He listened carefully to every returning pilot, paying attention not only to what they said but how they said it. Pilots rarely described problems in engineering terms, they described feelings. The nose feels heavy in the climb. Rolls take too long to catch. She doesn't want to lift when I need her to. These impressions held truth that manuals couldn't explain. He also understood the Zero's behavioral profile. Reports circulated through every squadron: the Japanese fighter could outturn anything the US fielded. But the Zero paid for its agility with vulnerability. Its lack of armor meant it couldn't absorb hits. Its light airframe made it prone to structural stress at high speeds. If an American fighter could gain just a little more responsiveness, just enough to break a predictable pattern, then a pilot could force a Japanese aviator into a mistake. That insight planted the seed for what would become the junk fix. In the mechanic's mind, the solution didn't require a complete overhaul. It needed refinement at a small but critical point: throttle responsiveness, structural stability during roll initiation, or airflow consistency across the control surfaces. Even a marginal enhancement could translate into a decisive edge in combat. But conventional repairs couldn't achieve what he envisioned. The parts necessary for such improvements were stuck somewhere in the supply chain, weeks from arrival. The squadron didn't have the luxury of waiting. Every mission increased the risk. The enemy's confidence grew with each encounter. So the mechanic began looking not at what he lacked, but at what he had. Scrap aluminum from a damaged wing section. An assortment of bolts left over from past repairs. A spare linkage bracket designed for a different aircraft model. Individual parts that, on their own, seemed useless. But when combined thoughtfully, they might create the adjustment no one expected. The war had pushed the squadron into a corner where innovation was no longer optional. And as the mechanic prepared to test his idea, the gap between American limitations and Japanese superiority narrowed to a razor-thin margin. That razor-thin margin would soon be transformed by the most unlikely modification on the airfield. He had been on the island for only 6 months, but the Pacific had already carved deep lines into his face. The mechanic, known simply by his surname on the maintenance roster, was one of those men whose presence never drew attention yet whose work quietly determined who lived and who didn't. His uniform always bore the same dark streaks of oil, and his hands never seemed to lose the faint metallic smell of engine grease, even after washing them in cold water from rusted drums. He wasn't glamorous, and he never tried to be. While pilots became the visible heroes of aerial victories, mechanics like him existed in the background, carrying the responsibility of ensuring those same pilots could return home. Every time a fighter limped back, bullet holes stitched across its wings or oil streaking its belly, he approached it not with frustration but with a steady, methodical calm. He understood the stakes. He had seen what happened when a repair failed at altitude. He had helped collect what little remained of aircraft that never returned. The fighter he now studied was not broken. It wasn't damaged or crippled. It simply wasn't good enough. Its pilot had survived several encounters only by diving away or relying on speed that evaporated too quickly. The Zero pilot seemed to anticipate every American move because the aircraft behaved predictably. If the fighter didn't change, its fate seemed predetermined. The mechanic leaned against the wing root, arms crossed, thinking. He could hear distant generators humming. Tools clinked from another tent. Sweat ran down the side of his face, catching dust from the airstrip. A gentle wind carried the smell of salt and distant jungle. Nothing in that environment suggested inspiration, but necessity often created its own spark. He began by pulling off the cowling. The engine lay exposed like a living thing, metal warmed by the island heat. He checked throttle linkages, control cables, and airflow baffles one by one. They were functional, but that wasn't enough. If the aircraft was to keep its pilot alive, it needed to respond sharper, cleaner, faster in the critical first seconds of an aerial maneuver. He remembered something from months earlier, an improvised fix performed on a different aircraft model, meant to stabilize airflow over a cooling system. It had used nothing more than a bent bracket and a few repurposed bolts. The principle had been simple: redirect what you already have, rather than trying to add what you lack. The idea lingered in his mind. Behind the maintenance tent, the scrap pile waited beneath a sheet of blistered canvas. Most mechanics saw junk. He saw possibilities. Broken brackets, warped aluminum strips, discarded control rods, containers of mismatched bolts, all remnants of fighters too damaged to restore. He sifted through them with practiced eyes, searching not for perfection but for potential. He selected a handful of parts: a curved aluminum panel torn from a wing section, a small bracket that should have been thrown away, and bolts slightly longer than standard. None belonged together. But he had a vision forming, one that involved repositioning airflow guides, adjusting the throttle response linkage, and reinforcing a weak point in the roll control assembly. Separately, the improvements would be slight. Together, they might alter how the aircraft behaved in the sky. Returning to the fighter, he began fitting the pieces. The aluminum strip, reshaped by hand and mallet, formed an improvised airflow deflector inside the cowling. The bracket, carefully drilled and refitted, changed how the throttle linkage reacted to sudden power demands. The longer bolt secured a reinforced connection where the original had shown signs of strain. He worked slowly at first, then faster as confidence built. Sweat soaked his shirt. The island sun lowered beyond the tree line. Shadows stretched across the airfield. When he finished, he stepped back and exhaled. The modification was crude by factory standards. It wouldn't win any technical awards. It certainly wouldn't appear in any official manuals. But it was strong, secure, and purposeful. It was, in every sense, a junk fix, born from scraps, necessity, and experience. He knew the risks. If the adjustment failed, the aircraft might behave unpredictably in the air. Command would question his judgment. Pilots might distrust the machine. But he also understood the alternative, sending a man into combat with a fighter that could barely keep pace with the enemy. The war had reached a point where safe decisions no longer guaranteed survival. When the pilot arrived later that evening to check on repairs, the mechanic didn't oversell the modification. He simply explained that the aircraft might feel different, a little sharper here, a little quicker there. No promises. No bravado. Just honesty forged from responsibility. The pilot listened carefully. He trusted the mechanic. Every man in the squadron knew that this quiet figure with grease-stained hands cared precisely about one thing, bringing them back alive. As the air grew cooler and the night settled over the island, the fighter sat ready on the strip, its engine silent, its new modifications hidden from anyone who didn't know where to look. It no longer resembled the machine it had been that morning. The change was subtle, just enough to matter, just enough to challenge the assumptions of the pilots who would soon face it. Before dawn, that junk fix would be tested in the sky. And the results would begin reshaping the squadron's fate. For months, Japanese aviators had believed they understood American fighters better than the Americans themselves. Their confidence wasn't empty bravado, it was shaped by experience. They had fought from China to the Solomons, across miles of ocean and jungle-covered islands, and their victories had shaped a mindset that felt almost unshakable by early 1943. When Japanese pilots studied American aircraft, they didn't just analyze performance charts. They watched behavior. They observed patterns. They reviewed every scrap of intelligence gathered from reconnaissance flights and recovered wreckage. Their reasoning was simple: if an enemy fighter behaved predictably, it could be controlled. And if it could be controlled, it could be destroyed. The Zero, with its extraordinary agility, thrived on exploiting those predictable weaknesses. Japanese aviators had become masters of energy manipulation, forcing opponents into turn fights, climbing spirals, or sudden role reversals that heavier American aircraft struggled to counter. Their doctrine emphasized fluidity and initiative. As long as the Zero stayed light, responsive, and aggressive, Japanese pilots believed no American fighter could outmaneuver them at equal altitude. Reports among Japanese units repeated these assumptions so often they became accepted truth. American planes were fast in the dive, strong in the wings, slow in the fight. The Zero was light in the fight, responsive at every angle. These statements, while oversimplified, shaped tactical behavior across entire formations. In many previous engagements, Japanese pilots had found American responses nearly identical: hard dives, shallow brake turns, and predictable attempts to disengage. Pilots joked that they could see the future when fighting U.S. aircraft, because their opponents rarely attempted maneuvers that pushed the limits of their machine. Within this perceived pattern, Japanese flyers felt secure. But this confidence carried an unseen flaw: they underestimated American adaptability. Japanese doctrine rarely accounted for irregular behavior. Their fighter training emphasized mastering the machine, not modifying it. Pilots relied heavily on the Zero's factory-built characteristics, trusting design more than improvisation. If the aircraft performed as expected, their tactics worked flawlessly. But if the enemy aircraft broke pattern, even slightly, the carefully built tactical flow could collapse. That was the hidden vulnerability Japanese intelligence didn't fully appreciate. American units, particularly their ground crews, refused to remain trapped by technical limitations. They didn't worship the design, they modified it. They pushed it, reshaped it, sometimes even contradicted it. A Zero pilot expected consistency. An American mechanic embraced improvisation. Still, Japanese aviators had little reason to foresee anything different. Their recent encounters reinforced the same belief: American aircraft were not evolving fast enough to challenge their maneuvering dominance. Squadron debriefings highlighted the same conclusions. U.S. fighters rolled too slowly to match Japanese counters, climbed too sluggishly to challenge Zero vertical spirals, and reacted too late when pressured aggressively. It was this mixture of experience and overconfidence that would soon set them up for shock. Several Japanese pilots stationed within range of the American-held island had already flown reconnaissance over the airfield. They saw nothing unusual, just the familiar outlines of American fighters, the same silhouettes they had faced for months. They noted damaged planes, replacement parts scattered around maintenance tents, and the typical slow taxiing of U.S. aircraft during warm-up procedures. Nothing suggested change. No new model. No upgraded engine. No reinforcements. Just another day of predictable American operations. What Japanese pilots could not see, what no aerial reconnaissance could have detected, was the quiet innovation happening under a tent at the edge of the field. They didn't know that a single fighter now carried a modification that altered how its engine responded to sudden power demands. They didn't see the subtle reinforcement that allowed the aircraft to roll with unexpected sharpness. They had no way to guess that airflow had been subtly reshaped around the engine housing. To them, the fighter would look the same. But it would not fly the same. And that assumption, that dangerous assumption, would soon collide with reality. For Japanese aviators who took to the skies the next morning, their confidence felt completely justified. They believed they were entering another standard engagement. Another chance to outmaneuver American pilots. Another opportunity to assert superiority. They didn't know they were minutes away from witnessing a maneuver so abrupt and so uncharacteristic that it would shatter their expectations. Because dawn was coming. The American pilot was preparing for his first test flight. And the junk fix was ready to reveal its true impact. Before sunrise, the island was quiet in a way only wartime outposts could ever be, an uneasy silence built from tired men, restless engines, and the knowledge that the day ahead might demand more than anyone could give. The air felt cool for once, carrying the faint smell of salt and the distant rustle of palm leaves swaying along the ridge. In the pre-dawn darkness, floodlights cast long shadows across the runway, illuminating the fighter waiting for its trial. The mechanic stood beside it, arms folded, watching as the pilot approached. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Both men understood what this morning represented, a risk, a test, a gamble built from scraps. The junk fix hidden beneath the cowling would either prove itself, or expose its flaws in the first few seconds after liftoff. The pilot climbed into the cockpit, adjusted his harness, and ran through pre-flight checks. Gauges flickered. Switches clicked. Fuel pumps rattled awake. The mechanic moved forward and rotated the propeller by hand, one blade at a time, feeling the resistance in the engine just as he had the night before. Everything aligned. Everything felt tight. He stepped back. The pilot pressed the starter. The engine roared to life. Immediately, the mechanic listened for what no one else would notice, the rhythm of combustion, the subtle harmony of parts moving together. And there it was, a cleaner response, a sharper rise in RPM, a reduction in the brief sputter that had plagued the aircraft for weeks. The modification was working. At least on the ground. But the sky would be the real judge. The pilot taxied slowly, the wheels crunching across the coral runway. The aircraft paused momentarily at the end of the strip. The pilot locked his eyes down the runway, steadying his breath. This wasn't combat. It wasn't a mission. It was a test, but one with life-or-death implications for every future sortie. He pushed the throttle forward. The response was immediate, far more immediate than before. Instead of lagging, the engine surged with a crisp, almost aggressive acceleration. The mechanic felt his chest tighten. This was exactly what he had hoped for, but seeing it in motion gave it weight. Dirt kicked up behind the fighter. The wheels lifted earlier than expected. And within seconds, the aircraft was climbing into the soft morning light. At first, the pilot kept movements conservative. Gentle banks. Light turns. He monitored the gauges, watching temperatures and pressure. The modifications held steady. No irregular vibrations. No sudden spikes. Everything remained stable. Then he began to test the edges. A shallow climb became a steeper one. The engine responded without hesitation. The pilot felt the fighter pulling, stretching upward with more confidence than he had felt in weeks. He rolled the aircraft, slowly at first, then faster. The reinforcement the mechanic had installed redistributed stress smoothly across the control surface. The roll rate sharpened. The aircraft felt lighter, more willing, almost eager. He pushed the throttle rapidly forward, then pulled it back. The modified linkage reacted instantly, with none of the sluggish delay that once plagued power changes. The fighter maintained energy instead of bleeding it away during transitions. For the first time, the pilot felt a margin, small, but real, opening between what his aircraft used to be and what it had just become. Below, the mechanic watched every move. He knew aircraft language the way a musician knows rhythm. When an airplane climbed sharply without wobble, it spoke of structural strength. When it rolled quickly without hesitation, it spoke of balance. And when it banked sharply with its nose steady, it spoke of airflow that finally cooperated instead of resisted. Everything pointed to one truth. The fix wasn't just working. It was transforming the aircraft. The pilot brought the fighter low on a fast pass over the airfield, the engine's full-throated roar echoing across tents and fuel drums. Men looked up from breakfast kits and maintenance benches. Heads turned. Some pilots walked out of their quarters, squinting at the silhouette flashing overhead. They knew that sound. But they had never heard it quite like this, cleaner, sharper, more aggressive. When the fighter touched down and rolled to a stop, the pilot climbed out with an expression that mixed disbelief and relief. His boots hit the ground. He didn't shout. He didn't cheer. He simply nodded at the mechanic, a single, firm nod that conveyed everything. "It's different," he said quietly. "Better. Faster." And he meant it. A few other pilots gathered around, curious. The mechanic explained only what mattered, that the aircraft would now respond more sharply in the first seconds of a maneuver. The rest, he said, would be up to the one flying it. What no one could predict was that the test flight had already attracted unintended observers. Japanese reconnaissance pilots frequently passed high overhead at dawn, checking for unusual activities. This morning, one such pilot spotted the American fighter's steep climb and unusual roll rate. He made note of it. But he dismissed it quickly. After all, American planes couldn't do that. Or so he believed. But within hours, Japanese fighters would find out the truth the hard way. The next time this aircraft rose into the sky, it wouldn't be alone. And the junk fix would face its first combat test. By midday, the Pacific sky had shifted from pale blue to a harsh, blazing white. Heat shimmered above the coral airstrip, and the rumble of distant engines warned the squadron that Japanese fighters were already active somewhere beyond the horizon. No one knew when the next raid would come, only that it would come soon. The American pilots studied the sky with an instinct shaped by months of combat, reading cloud shadows, listening for echoes, watching for glints of sunlight that didn't belong. The pilot of the modified fighter waited in the ready line, strapped in and focused. His aircraft idled with a steady rhythm, its engine humming with the confidence of the morning's test flight. Beneath the cowling, the mechanic's junk fix held firm, invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. It had already changed the way the aircraft behaved. Now, it would face the ultimate measure of truth, combat. At 12:47 p.m., the warning came. Ground observers spotted formation trails high above the northern perimeter, thin white scratches cutting across the blue. Seconds later, the base alarm wailed across the island, its rise and fall slicing through the heat like a blade. Men ran toward shelters. Pilots sprinted to their aircraft. Mechanics dove clear as engines roared awake across the field. The pilot advanced his throttle. The aircraft surged forward. Wheels lifted. The sky swallowed him. His wingmen formed up quickly, climbing in a loose defensive pattern as they scanned the horizon. The incoming enemy formation materialized like ghosts slipping out of the sun, sleek Zero fighters descending in twin elements, gliding with controlled menace. Their formation tightened as they approached, confident, disciplined, certain they could dictate the engagement as always. The American pilot felt his heart steady, not spike. He had flown against Zeros before. He knew their strengths, their tendencies, their patterns. But this time, something inside him felt different, sharper, cleaner, more connected to the machine around him. The fighter wasn't fighting him. It was responding. The Zeros struck first. Two enemy aircraft peeled off from the formation and dove sharply, their wings glinting as they aimed to isolate American fighters. Their attack angle suggested they expected a predictable response, an American brake turn, a slow roll, or a dive for separation. But the pilot did none of these things. Instead, he leveled his wings and waited, timing the moment perfectly. When the Zeros committed to their dive, he pushed the throttle forward sharply. The modified linkage reacted instantly. The fighter surged with a force that surprised even him. The nose lifted with confident precision. The acceleration held steady. He pulled the aircraft into a steep climbing arc, one he could never have executed reliably before the junk fix. The Japanese pilots expected hesitation. They saw none. The sudden change in angle stunned them. Their dive overshot by yards, forcing them to correct with abrupt rolls. In that split second of adjustment, the American pilot used his newfound responsiveness to roll sharply, the reinforced control assembly distributing stress cleanly across the wing. The aircraft snapped into position behind the trailing Zero. The enemy pilot must have felt the shift. He pulled hard into a climbing spiral, relying on the Zero's legendary agility. It was a maneuver that normally trapped American pilots into energy bleed, but this time, the American fighter held its momentum. The airflow deflector inside the cowling stabilized temperature fluctuations, preventing the engine from coughing or losing power mid-maneuver. For the first time in weeks, the American pilot felt himself climbing with the Zero, not falling behind. He stayed on the enemy's tail. The Zero tightened its spiral. The American fighter matched it. Below, Japanese wingmen watched with confusion. The American aircraft should have stalled or slipped by now. Instead, it clung to the Zero's wake with an insistence that defied everything they knew. The Zero pilot, realizing his usual tactics had failed, attempted to break left in a sudden turn, a maneuver Japanese doctrine relied on to regain initiative. The American pilot rolled with him instantly. The reinforced assembly absorbed the load smoothly. No lag. No delay. For the first time, the Zero was reacting to him. He fired once. A short burst. Tracers connected. The Zero jolted, smoke trailing from its wing root. The pilot didn't linger on the kill. Another Zero dove at him from above, guns flashing. He rolled sharply, sharper than any American aircraft had rolled in that squadron in months. The enemy rounds cut through empty air. The attacking Zero overshot, unprepared for the American fighter's sudden lateral movement. That mistake proved costly. The American pilot pulled into a high yo-yo maneuver, gaining position above the Zero. It was a tactic that normally required perfect timing and engine responsiveness, the kind that sluggish linkages or uneven airflow could ruin. But today, the fighter reacted precisely as needed. He dropped onto the Zero's tail like a hammer. Another controlled burst. Another enemy spiraling down. On the Japanese side, confusion spread. Their formation broke cohesion as pilots tried to reassess what they were facing. Radio chatter grew tense, uncertain. Observers on the ground later reported seeing Japanese fighters maneuvering in ways that suggested their pilots no longer trusted the usual patterns of engagement. For the first time, they weren't sure what the American fighters could do. The American pilot continued fighting with a confidence sharpened by each second in the air. He wasn't invincible, just no longer predictable. And that alone shifted the balance. His aircraft moved with newfound agility, rolling faster, climbing cleaner, and responding instantly to throttle changes. The junk fix was no miracle. But it was just enough. Just enough to tip every second in his favor. After nearly 12 minutes of combat, the remaining Zeros broke off, trailing smoke, altitude, or uncertainty. They fled toward the safety of clouds and distance, leaving behind a sky now owned by American pilots. The airfield below erupted with relief as the fighters returned. But the greatest shock belonged not to the Americans, but to the Japanese pilots who survived. They had just witnessed an American fighter perform a maneuver they believed impossible. A maneuver born not from a factory, but from an improvised fix made with scraps. And that revelation would soon echo far beyond this single battle, shaping reports, intelligence assessments, and the morale of both sides. The aftermath of this engagement would prove almost as important as the fight itself. When the American fighter touched down after the battle, its tires screeched lightly against the coral surface, rolling to a gradual stop as ground crews rushed forward. Heat radiated from its engine cowling. The fuselage bore streaks of powder haze from gunfire. But the aircraft was intact, more than intact. It had just done what no U.S. fighter in that unit had accomplished in months. The pilot climbed out slowly, his knees stiff, his flight suit drenched in sweat, yet his expression carried a calm disbelief that told the entire story. Other pilots gathered around him, wanting details. Not out of celebration, but out of genuine confusion. They had witnessed maneuvers that didn't match the aircraft they thought they knew. They had seen a Zero outmaneuvered in vertical transitions. They had seen rolls executed faster than the squadron's standard performance charts allowed. They had seen a chase spiral reversed in mid-air. Word spread quickly across the airstrip, something unusual had happened today, something no one could fully explain yet. The mechanic stayed in the background, hands still stained with grease, listening as pilots recounted the engagement. He didn't step forward or claim credit. He simply watched the fighter cool, steam fading gently from its exhaust stacks, the aircraft now carrying a silent proof of what improvised engineering could accomplish under pressure. The junk fix had not only held, it had outperformed expectations so dramatically that pilots struggled to believe it was the same machine they had flown before. By late afternoon, reports began flowing through the chain of command. The pilot's official after-action account described the aircraft as significantly more responsive during roll initiation, more stable in rapid throttle transitions, and capable of sustaining climb performance in maneuvers normally requiring energy advantages. These words drew immediate attention from officers who reviewed operational readiness. American command had seen improvisations before, but rarely had they seen one produce such measurable combat advantage. Squadron leadership ordered the aircraft pulled into a maintenance tent for inspection. Senior mechanics from neighboring units came to evaluate the fix. They studied the airflow deflector, the reinforced bracket, the reworked linkage. They noted the craftsmanship, crude, improvised, but undeniably functional. One officer remarked privately that if the modification had been submitted in a formal engineering review, it might have been rejected for violating too many technical standards. Yet here it was, proving itself in combat. As the Americans documented the changes, the Japanese were conducting their own assessments. Pilots who returned from the failed engagement filed reports filled with contradictions. They described an American fighter climbing with them in a spiral, a maneuver previously considered impossible for U.S. aircraft of that weight. They noted a roll rate that seemed faster, sharper, or unnaturally responsive. Some Japanese pilots insisted they had encountered a new American model. Others believed the opposing pilot had simply executed the impossible. None suspected the truth. The transformation came from scrap metal and a mechanic's intuition. Japanese intelligence analysts reviewed these reports with skepticism. They cross-referenced previous encounters and found no evidence of a new American variant in the region. But they could not ignore the descriptions. The Zero's advantage had been stability in turn fights, predictable enemy reactions, and superior climb in short engagements. That advantage now appeared challenged, not by technology from factories, but by innovation happening on small, dusty islands miles from supply depots. Inside the American squadron, morale lifted in ways no speech or order could replicate. Pilots felt something they had not felt in weeks: possibility. The idea that the enemy could be surprised, that American aircraft could evolve in real time, shifted their mindset. They no longer viewed the Zero as untouchable. The margin between life and death had widened slightly, enough to give courage where exhaustion once lingered. The mechanic finally received quiet acknowledgement from squadron leadership. Nothing dramatic. No ceremony. Just a firm pat on the shoulder and a simple statement: "Good work." But the pilot's reactions meant more. Several approached him individually, asking if their fighters could receive the same modification. They didn't need technical explanations. They had seen the results in the sky. Work began immediately. Scrap parts were sorted. Tools were prepared. Measurements were taken. The mechanic began teaching others how to replicate the fix. It spread across the squadron with remarkable efficiency, not as a formal upgrade, but as a field-borne innovation shaped by necessity. The battle where Japanese pilots were stunned would not be recorded as one of the largest engagements of the Pacific War. No major strategic position changed hands. But within the small world of maintenance tents and coral runways, it created a ripple that influenced countless future missions. Because on that hot afternoon, the Americans realized something vital. Superiority didn't always come from factories. Sometimes, it came from a bolt, a bracket, and the hands of a mechanic who refused to accept the limits of his aircraft. And that quiet revelation leads naturally into the deeper meaning of this story. In the long history of the Pacific Air War, most stories focus on the aircraft that dominated the sky or the pilots whose names became symbols of courage. Rarely do the records pause to acknowledge the quiet hands that shaped the machines themselves, the men who worked in heat, dust, and exhaustion, knowing their efforts would decide whether someone lived to see another sunrise. This story belongs to them as much as anyone who ever climbed into a cockpit. The junk fix that stunned Japanese pilots was never intended to be extraordinary. It wasn't built by a design bureau, approved by engineers, or imagined in a boardroom. It came from necessity, intuition, and a deep understanding of how machines behave when pushed to their limits. It came from a man who refused to accept that a pilot under his care would face superior enemy fighters without every advantage he could possibly create. The Pacific did not reward perfection. It rewarded adaptation. It rewarded those who could look at a pile of discarded fragments and see not failure, but potential. For the men who lived on those airstrips, sleeping in tents, eating from ration tins, repairing aircraft by lantern light, innovation wasn't optional. It was survival. What happened that day in the sky did more than shift a single battle. It challenged assumptions on both sides. It reminded American pilots that their fate was tied to the ingenuity of people who never flew. It forced Japanese aviators to confront the idea that American aircraft could change faster than intelligence reports predicted. And it showed that even in a war defined by massive industrial production, individual creativity still held the power to reshape outcomes. When historians look back on the Pacific War, they see vast movements of fleets and armies. But on islands scattered across thousands of miles, victory often depended on moments like this, moments when a single act of improvisation opened a new path forward. In the end, the mechanic's fix was more than a technical adjustment. It became a symbol of American resilience, the belief that no challenge is final, no weakness is permanent, and no machine is beyond improvement when lives depend on it.